finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, or everywhere is war. Say war.
Congo sees war. Children are dying. Oh.
Until there are no longer first class, second class citizens of any nation.
February the 11th, 1990 was one of the great days in the history of South Africa. The leader of the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, left Victor Vorster prison outside Cape Town a free man for the first time for 27 years. In 1964, he'd been sentenced to prison for life on charges of treason against the state. He'd spent most of his time in the notorious prison on Robben Island off South Africa's southern coast. His wife Winnie was with him as he walked out to freedom, cheered by the small crowd the police had allowed close to the jail. Later in Cape Town, it was a different story. 50,000 people turned out to greet their hero, who was taken to stay at Bishop's Court, Archbishop Tutu's residence on the slopes of Table Mountain. It could hardly have been a greater contrast to the grim conditions the ANC leader had lived in for so many years. His first words in public for a quarter of a century were greetings to the world in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all. He thanked those who'd campaigned on his behalf through the years and praised President de Klerk as a man of integrity. But he also warned that political protest must continue until all black South Africans were free and equal partners with the whites. At his first press conference, he was asked for his impressions of South Africa and about the welcome he'd received.
I must confess I'm unable to describe my emotions. I was completely overwhelmed by the enthusiasm. It's something I did not expect. And I will be merely rationalizing if I told you that I am able to describe my own feelings. It was breathtaking. That's all I can say.
But the euphoria surrounding Mr. Mandela's release was short-lived. His ANC supporters were soon fighting with members of the Zulu Inkatha movement, and the white right wing in South Africa were also outraged at the government's decision to release him. Violence in South Africa seemed set for many years to come.
Africans want to be paid a living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing, and not work which the government declares them to be capable of. We want to be allowed to live where we obtain work, and not be endorsed out of an area because we were not born there. We want to be allowed and not to be obliged to live in rented houses which we can never call our own. We want to be part of the general population and not confined to living in our ghettos. African men want to have their wives and children to live with them where they work, and not to be forced into an unnatural existence in men's hostels. Our women want to be with their men folk and not to be left permanently widowed in the reserves. We want to be allowed out after 11 o'clock at night and not to be confined to our rooms like little children. We want to be allowed to travel in our own country and to seek work where we want to, and not where the Labor Bureau tells us to. We want a just share in the whole of South Africa. We want security and a stake in society. Above all, my Lord, we want equal political rights, because without them, our disabilities will be permanent. I know voters will be Africans. This makes the white man fear democracy. But this fear cannot be allowed to stand in the way of the only solution which will guarantee racial harmony and freedom for all. It is not true that the enfranchisement of all will result in racial domination. Political division based on caste is entirely artificial. And when it disappears, so will the domination of one color group by another.
With us this morning is Dominee Adrian Berger, Secretary of the Federal Council of Dutch Reformed Churches and editor of Die Volkte, the Transvaal Church magazine. Dominee Berger, you believe in apartheid as a way of life.
Yes, I do.
Why?
In South Africa.
Why is that, sir?
Because the race, which is in a lesser state of development, is by far in the majority here. And numerically, of course, they are much stronger. And because also I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved. And also everything we have done in the last 300 years and built up in the church and in the state should be preserved and not be swallowed up by an, I wouldn't say inferior race, because I don't believe it is an inferior race, but a lesser a race which is in a lesser state of development, that's all.
Mr. Prinsloo, what is the basic philosophy underlying apartheid as a way of life?
We Europeans who've lived in this country for more than 300 years have come to a conclusion which is strange to some people in the Western world, namely that the peoples of Africa, and so the Bantu people of South Africa, have a beautiful civilization of their own which is worth preserving. There are many facets of this civilization. For instance, the social warmth of the Bantu peoples, which we Westerners can rightly envy them. Now, we also have a peculiar Western adaptation to Africa. Therefore, we can say that the Bantu peoples are a flower and the Western peoples are a flower, each with a beauty of its own.
What is behind the firm, continued refusal of African women to accept passes?
Well, the passes have been enforced in South Africa for a very long time amongst the men. And it has become very clear that the pass system in South Africa is the basis of forced and cheap labor. Now, to impose such a system on the African women is to create hardships. Firstly, African women will have to produce these passes on demand. If they fail to do so, they will be arrested in the streets, they will be stopped at stations, they will be stopped as they visit one another in the locations, and if they haven't got those passes, they will be immediately arrested and brought before the court. Now, African men who value their women just as any other people value their women, say what will happen to their children.
Beginning of a location in the town of Nelspruit, the African location where natives are forced to live. Nelspruit, a small mining town in the northern Transvaal, has for the past week been the focus of the racial tension in South Africa. It started with a protest march by some 400 native women on the police station. The women have long been more militant in their resistance to apartheid laws in South Africa than have been their menfolk. And in Nelspruit this week, the African woman has suddenly become the focal point of resistance to the nationalist government. Perhaps you can answer this one question that's intrigued me for a long time. There are, I am sure, devout believers in apartheid who are also devout Christians. Can these two, apartheid and Christianity, in your opinion, be reconciled?
I'm quite sure that they cannot. One of the mystifying things to me is how anybody who claims to be a Christian can be a disciple of apartheid.
Do you find any conflict between apartheid and Christianity?
No, certainly not. As a matter of fact, our Dutch Reformed churches are doing much more for the Christianization of the non-white people in this country than any other Protestant church in this country and anywhere in Africa. We as Christians believe in the development of the non-white people, and we certainly try to develop them as far as possible by building their churches, subsidizing them in their church work, and we are also trying to give them leadership where they want it. And our experience is that these people prefer to be left in their own churches. As a matter of fact, there are 9 different non-white churches belonging to the Dutch Reformed Church amongst the non-white people. And they prefer that. There are instances when we come together on a higher level in conferences and sometimes also in their churches. We often come there as white people to visit them, and there are also instances where we even have communion with them.
Can you foresee any eventual end to apartheid in the Dutch Reformed Church?
The Dutch Reformed Church does not practice apartheid because we believe that integration is religiously wrong or ethically wrong. Certainly not. In theory, we have nothing against integration. It's only a matter of practical policy in this country. Now, for this moment, if conditions should change, this or any other practical policy could also be changed.
I see. Is there any corollary, do you think, between American segregation and South African apartheid?
No, I think, well, in one sense, I think it's all part of a world pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the white race as a whole finds it extremely difficult to realize that they can no longer dominate the whole world. But the thing that encouraged me in America is that in spite of what has happened and is happening, the general trend is in entirely the opposite direction from what is happening in South Africa.
Do you, sir, believe that there's any possibility now or in the immediate foreseeable future of large-scale violence in South Africa?
No, there are a lot of people who seem to be very fearful that this may happen. But for my part, I'm convinced that all the responsible leadership among the Africans and the Indians is determined at all costs to prevent violence if they can possibly do so.
In June 1993, after giving notice to the authorities, Viljoen took a petition to the multi-party conference.
We were going to hand over at the World Trade Center some demands by the Volksfront. In other words, to have self-determination for the Afrikaner people. That was the intention.
The AWB, Avia Beer in Afrikaans, were among the petitioners.
Eventually we got news that some of the people entering rather late were harassed at the gate. Some people were pulled out of their cars. It was getting a bit more ugly.
Then when the gates went open, the people started moving in, and then people started running.
Terre Blanche was leading the AWB contingent.
And we tried to stop the crowd in front of the building. I got on top of a pole and I sort of signaled to all the people, and they did stop. And the whole crowd would have stopped in a very orderly manner. And then some AWB members on a vehicle came through. They ignored the warnings to stop.
They look like they're invading the place. Oh, look at it!
Confronted by the invasion of our nation, the white man must shed his blood against safe play. We fight the system. We fight the system. We fight the system. We fight the system. All together we'll overcome Zionism. All together we'll overcome Marxism. We will unfurl and fly our flags. We will lay down the white man's law. We fight the system. We fight the system. We fight the system. We fight the system. We will unfurl and fly our flags. We will lay down the white man's law. We will unfurl and fly our flags. We will lay down the white man's law. We fight the system. 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 We fight the system.
I've heard that in the South Africa of today, you can be classified as colored simply by looking colored. Is this, in point of fact, true?
Well, I can give you quite a, which may seem amusing, but rather humiliating incidents that occurred in our country when the Department of Census started reclassifying people. They all people with the trams in the mornings.
But the government opposes universal access to antiretroviral drugs known as ARVs. As Hilary Anderson reports from Johannesburg, drugs that are saving lives in developed countries are being denied to the poor.
Today's sermon, the people's hearts are leaving God. Worship the Lord with deeds, not words. Zibuse Dubi is being buried. He was 37. The village thinks a spell was cast on him. They won't name the spell as AIDS. He leaves 7 children behind and a wife. The wave of death is underway in South Africa. Whole populations are dying. Millions are already carrying the virus. Their only hope now is treatment.